The camera pans over a quiet small town at sunrise. Birds chirping, children running to school. Inside a cozy house, Richard, a respected father in his mid-50s, sets the table while his son Ethan and fiancée Clara laugh over coffee. The family seems perfect, smiling and joking like any other. But subtle glances linger. Richard's attention on Clara feels just a little too intense. Something isn't right. Watch closely, because this family secret will shock you. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from the heart of history. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen window as Clara poured herself a cup of tea. She smiled at Ethan, who was busy checking his work emails on his laptop, oblivious to her growing unease. Richard entered the room, impeccably dressed as always, his presence commanding yet unnervingly familiar. "Clara, did you see the garden this morning?" he asked, voice smooth, eyes lingering on her a second too long. She forced a polite smile, nodding, trying to dismiss the shiver that ran down her spine. Over the next few days, small moments began to unsettle Clara. Richard would comment on how well she looked in a particular dress, or offer advice on how she and Ethan should decorate their home, insisting it was for their future happiness. At first, she thought it was simply parental care, but there was something in the intensity of his gaze, a possessive undertone she couldn't quite name. She found herself avoiding eye contact when he spoke, her stomach tightening with each compliment that lingered too long. Ethan, immersed in wedding plans and work responsibilities, barely noticed. He joked with Clara one evening, "Your dad seems to be everywhere lately, doesn't he?" She laughed nervously, brushing off the feeling as imagined at Shinshin. But late at night, lying awake in bed, Clara would recall the subtle ways Richard had positioned himself beside her during family dinners, or casually touching her arm under the pretense of a joke. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet deeply unsettling. A knot of discomfort grew inside her, and for the first time, she wondered if something was fundamentally wrong. Meanwhile, Richard played his role perfectly in front of the world. Neighbors praised his attentiveness. Friends commented on what a devoted father he was, and Ethan remained entirely unaware of any danger. Richard knew how to maintain appearances, masking his obsession beneath charm and fatherly advice. He would whisper suggestions in Clara's ear during quiet moments, advice about her clothing, subtle criticisms of Ethan's habits, or encouragement to share private thoughts with him. Each suggestion seemed innocent on the surface, but beneath, it nudged Clara toward dependence on him emotionally, creating a web she didn't yet recognize. Clara tried confiding in her closest friend, Julia, about the strange tension she felt. "I don't know if I'm overreacting," Clara admitted, fingers twisting the teacup. "Sometimes I feel like your dad is looking at me differently, like he's watching me." Julia frowned, concern creasing her brow. "That doesn't sound normal." "Keep your distance if it makes you uncomfortable." Clara nodded, but the unease stayed. She didn't know how to escape it, especially since Ethan trusted his father completely. She felt trapped between loyalty, fear, and the faint, confusing attention that Richard lavished upon her. Small, almost meaningless moments compounded daily, a brush of Richard's hand on her shoulder, lingering compliments about her beauty, invitations to talk privately under the guise of fatherly concern. Each time, Clara's heart raced, guilt and fear intertwining. She realized that something was changing inside her, an awareness of Richard's obsession that frightened her, yet she couldn't yet name it as danger. The tension in the house grew like a silent storm, pressing down on her chest with every shared family meal, every cheerful joke from Ethan that she could no longer fully enjoy. Even as life appeared perfect from the outside, a shadow had begun to stretch across their small home. Clara felt its weight, subtle but undeniable. "And Richard?" He smiled, carefully, patiently, knowing the first threads of control were already weaving themselves around the one person he wanted most, his son's bride. The following week, the subtle tension in the household escalated into something more pronounced. Richard began spending more one-on-one time with Clara, under the guise of helping with wedding plans. "I've been thinking about your dress," he said one afternoon, leaning closer than necessary as he examined fabric swatches. "I think this shade really brings out your eyes. You know, you deserve only the best." His tone was casual, almost fatherly, but Clara couldn't shake the unease creeping into her chest. She forced a smile, feeling an unearned warmth that embarrassed her. Richard was meticulous in his approach. He complimented her intelligence and taste, often pointing out how Ethan sometimes failed to notice the smaller details of her personality. At first, Clara dismissed these comments as harmless observations, but she couldn't deny the way they planted doubt in her mind. Was Ethan truly attentive enough? Did he see her as fully as Richard did? She chastised herself for entertaining such thoughts, yet they gnawed at her nonetheless. Richard's manipulation extended beyond words. He orchestrated small moments where he appeared as her protector and confidant. One evening, when Ethan had a sudden work emergency, Richard suggested, "Why don't we go for a walk? Just you and me. I know how stressful things can be." Clara hesitated, but felt oddly comforted, and the walk turned into a quiet conversation filled with empathy and shared laughter. Every smile, every understanding word from Richard slowly eroded her certainty, making Ethan seem distant in comparison, not at home. The power of subtle suggestion became Richard's weapon. He praised Clara for being able to see things clearly, or think deeply, phrases he repeated at opportune moments. He would casually remind her of the sacrifices he'd made for his family, framing himself as someone who truly understood her needs more than anyone else could. In her confusion, Clara began to seek his approval, almost unconsciously, feeling a dangerous mix of admiration and guilt. Ethan, still trusting his father implicitly, remained largely oblivious. He joked about how helpful Richard had become, not noticing Clara's distracted demeanor or the fleeting tension in her eyes. "Dad's really taking over the planning, huh?" Ethan laughed one night at dinner. Clara nodded weakly, hiding the swirl of emotions Richard had stirred within her. Every glance from him, every carefully crafted phrase, weighed on her conscience, leaving her unsure of what she truly felt. Richard's influence even reached Clara's personal moments. She caught herself thinking about him at unexpected times during errands, in quiet moments at home, when Ethan was present, yet seemingly unaware. Each fleeting thought made her panic internally, but Richard's occasional affirmations, "You're special, Clara. You understand me," reassured her. She could feel herself slipping, drawn toward him in a way that terrified her. It was subtle, insidious, and utterly consuming. The emotional manipulation reached its peak when Richard began isolating Clara from outside perspectives. He subtly questioned her friend's intentions, sowing seeds of doubt. "Julia doesn't really understand you like I do, does she?" He framed Ethan as loving, but perhaps incapable of appreciating her fully. Clara struggled to defend herself internally, recognizing the coercion, yet feeling powerless against the overwhelming attention he lavished. Each interaction left her more conflicted, more dependent on his validation, and yet more guilty for the feelings that were growing against her own. Well, by the end of the week, Clara realized that her world had shifted. Ethan still loved her, still trusted her, still depended on her for affection. And yet, in quiet, almost imperceptible ways, she felt a bond forming with Richard, one that frightened her more than she cared to admit. The house, once warm and familiar, now felt suffocating with tension. "And Richard?" He smiled, knowing that the first cracks of loyalty were forming, delicate but irreversible. Days turned into weeks, and the once cheerful household began to feel tense under an invisible pressure. Clara found herself walking on eggshells, carefully choosing her words whenever Richard was around. Ethan noticed subtle shifts too. Her laughter seemed forced, her gaze occasionally distant, and the warmth in her voice toward him had a faint hesitation he couldn't explain. He tried to dismiss it as stress from wedding planning, but a gnawing unease began to creep into his chest. Richard's subtle control grew stronger. He would schedule father-daughter outings under the pretense of helping with wedding details, ensuring that Ethan was busy elsewhere. When Ethan expressed a desire to join, Richard would skillfully deflect. "You go handle your work, Ethan. Clara and I need some uninterrupted time. You know how stressful planning can be for her." Ethan reluctantly agreed, trusting his father completely, unaware of the tension brewing beneath the surface. Clara felt trapped in a tightening web. Each interaction with Richard left her more conflicted guilt and confusion intertwined with a perverse comfort in his attention. During one quiet evening in the living room, Richard gently placed a hand on her arm. "You know, Clara, you don't have to share everything with Ethan. He wouldn't understand the way I do." The words, casual on the surface, struck her deeply. She withdrew instinctively, a flush of panic rising, but Richard's calm, steady gaze quelled some of the fear, making her question her own feelings. Ethan began to notice changes he couldn't ignore. Clara would appear distracted, checking her phone excessively, and sometimes staring blankly, lost in thought. He asked if she was okay, but she insisted she was fine, smiling weakly. A seed of doubt took root in Ethan's mind. Was something happening between his father and fiancée? The thought felt absurd, impossible, yet a small, uncomfortable part of him couldn't shake it. Richard, sensing Ethan's subtle suspicions, worked even harder to isolate the young couple emotionally. He criticized Ethan's decisions gently in private, emphasizing his experience and wisdom, and presented himself as the only one who truly understood Clara. "Sometimes, Ethan," he said one evening, "I think you're too focused on your work to notice what's really important for her happiness." Ethan, blindsided by his father's insinuations, felt both guilty and defensive. Unsure of how to respond without seeming ungrateful or dismissive, social gatherings became a stage for manipulation. Richard would steer conversations toward topics highlighting Ethan's perceived shortcomings, always framing himself as a voice of reason. Clara, caught between guilt and a growing, uneasy fascination, started avoiding outings with friends, citing work or family obligations. Even her closest confidants noticed the shift. Her laughter no longer flowed naturally, and she seemed increasingly isolated. The emotional distance between her and Ethan widened, exactly as Richard intended. At home, the tension was palpable. Meals became quieter, punctuated by small, loaded glances and unspoken thoughts. Clara often found herself retreating to her room, mentally replaying her interactions with Richard, questioning why his attention made her feel simultaneously terrified and comforted. Ethan, increasingly anxious, tried to bridge the gap, but every attempt met subtle resistance. Clara's distracted replies, fleeting expressions, and avoidance. The isolation deepened, creating fertile ground for the next stage of Richard's psychological manipulation. By the end of the week, the household's dynamic had shifted completely. Ethan felt distant, frustrated, and powerless to reconnect with Clara, while Clara struggled internally with a confusing mix of loyalty, fear, and fascination toward Richard. Richard observed silently, the architect of the growing rift, his influence now undeniable. The family, once united, now teetered on the brink of emotional collapse, a storm forming quietly in plain sight. The engagement party had been planned for weeks, a celebration meant to honor Ethan and Clara's love. The venue, a charming hall filled with soft lights and floral arrangements, buzzed with friends, family, and neighbors. Everything seemed perfect on the surface, but beneath the laughter and clinking glasses, tension simmered like an unseen flame. Clara, dressed in a pale lavender gown, felt her chest tighten as Richard hovered nearby, offering quiet compliments that sent her mind spinning. His gaze lingered too long, and she caught herself shivering at the intensity. Ethan, radiant with excitement, smiled proudly at the crowd, introducing Clara to distant relatives and friends. Yet he couldn't help noticing the subtle ways his father kept positioning himself beside her, whispering remarks that made her smile or blush. At first, he ignored it, attributing it to fatherly pride, but the pit in his stomach refused to settle. Something in the dynamic felt off, and the longer the evening went on, the heavier the weight of unease became as the party progressed. Richard orchestrated moments that placed himself close to Clara whenever Ethan's attention wavered. During a toast, he leaned in to whisper a compliment about her appearance, and the resulting flush of her cheeks did not go unnoticed. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, though he tried to mask his suspicion with a polite smile. Richard, sensing Ethan's growing unease, maintained perfect composure, his charming exterior hiding a calculated intent. The first undeniable betrayal occurred after the dinner. Ethan had stepped outside to make a phone call, leaving Clara near the dessert table. Richard approached, casually brushing his hand along hers in a manner that seemed accidental but carried weight. "You handled that conversation beautifully," he murmured, voice low, almost intimate. Clara's breath hitched. She pulled her hand back, and yet something in his words stirred a forbidden thrill she couldn't ignore. Ethan returned moments later, his face registering subtle tension. "Everything okay?" he asked, voice tight with concern. Clara nodded, forcing a smile, but the energy between her and Richard had shifted. That small, intimate exchange, though seemingly harmless, marked the beginning of a fracture that could not easily be repaired. Ethan's suspicions grew, though he lacked concrete proof, and Clara's guilt intertwined with an unexplainable attraction that left her dizzy with confusion. Richard capitalized on the moment of tension. Later, during dancing, he insisted on guiding Clara gently through the steps, his hands resting at her waist slightly longer than appropriate. Every movement was calculated to make Ethan feel displaced while deepening Clara's emotional conflict. Ethan finally confronted the situation privately, pulling Clara aside. "Dad, I don't like the way he's acting around you," Ethan said quietly, voice tinged with anger and hurt. Clara tried to reassure him, stammering through excuses about misunderstandings, but the words rang hollow to both of them. The confrontation escalated as Richard entered, smiling disarmingly. "Ethan, don't be paranoid. Clara and I were just talking," he said smoothly. His calm, measured tone carried an unspoken power, subtly placing Ethan on the defensive. "You worry too much," Richard added, making Ethan feel foolish, uncertain, and frustrated. Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The first undeniable crack in her relationship with Ethan had formed, and she realized with horror that Richard's influence was already dangerously entrenched. By the end of the evening, whispers and glances had begun circulating among family and friends. No one openly questioned Richard's behavior, but subtle nods and looks between some guests indicated a growing sense that something wasn't right. Ethan left the party angry and confused, struggling to articulate the creeping unease in his mind. Clara, meanwhile, returned home with Richard, feeling the conflicting emotions of guilt, shame, and an inexplicable pull toward the man who had so carefully orchestrated the first betrayal. The stage was set. The first fracture in the family's trust had been made public, the dynamics irreversibly altered. Clara's loyalty and emotions were now in a dangerous state of flux. Richard's manipulation had proven effective, and Ethan's suspicions would only grow, setting up the emotional and psychological escalation that would lead to the ultimate betrayal. The days following the engagement party were suffused with tension, though no one outside the family could detect it. Richard had perfected the art of subtlety, his actions carefully measured to increase Clara's dependence while keeping Ethan oblivious, or at least uncertain. Clara found herself thinking of Richard at odd moments, while preparing breakfast, during errands, even in conversations with Ethan. The attention he lavished, the way he seemed to understand her better than anyone else, created a dangerous magnetic pull she couldn't resist. Richard orchestrated private moments that were framed as innocuous guidance, but carried a heavy emotional weight. He would invite Clara to walk with him in the garden, speak softly about her hopes and fears, and share stories of his past sacrifices and insights. Each tale reinforced his image as a man who could empathize, who could see her inner world with clarity. Clara's heart raced during these interactions, guilt battling against an inexplicable attraction. She tried to resist, but the isolation and careful attention made her more malleable. Ethan, increasingly distracted by work and wedding preparations, noticed changes but struggled to identify their source. Clara seemed tense around him at times, sometimes distant or lost in thought. When he tried to engage her in conversation, she responded politely, but with less warmth than before. He questioned himself silently. Was he imagining the signs? Was his father truly being inappropriate? Or was this his mind playing tricks under stress? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and frustration began to simmer beneath his composed exterior. Richard's manipulation extended beyond isolated moments. He subtly undermined Ethan, highlighting his lack of awareness or failure to notice details in front of Clara, ensuring she witnessed these comments. "You know, Ethan, sometimes I think Clara needs someone who truly sees her," he said casually one evening while discussing wedding plans. Clara felt an unbidden warmth at the statement, mingled with guilt for feeling that way at all. Ethan, defensive and frustrated, attempted to push back, but Richard's calm authority made him doubt himself, the words echoing in his mind long after the moment passed. Social gatherings became another instrument in Richard's plan. He would gently monopolize Clara's attention, subtly excluding Ethan or making him appear inattentive. Friends began to notice her distracted demeanor, her smiles directed toward her father rather than her fiancé. Even the closest confidants sensed the tension but struggled to intervene. Clara's polite insistence that everything was fine masked the storm brewing beneath. The psychological web tightened around her, leaving her emotionally ensnared and increasingly dependent on Richard's approval. At home, the subtlety of the manipulation intensified. Small gestures, a hand resting briefly on hers while guiding her through a conversation, the occasional lingering look, soft-spoken affirmations, worked to destabilize her sense of loyalty. Clara questioned her own reactions, the inappropriate feelings stirring in her heart, leaving her ashamed. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt charged with emotional electricity, every interaction layered with unspoken meaning and internal conflict. Richard also employed selective praise and criticism to shape her perceptions. He highlighted her uniqueness, her insight, and her empathy, framing Ethan as well-meaning but insufficiently attentive. Clara's confidence in her own judgment wavered, and she found herself seeking Richard's input more than Ethan's. The emotional manipulation reached a point where Clara could no longer discern whether her feelings were genuine, coerced, or a dangerous mix of both. By the end of the week, Clara's internal struggle had reached a boiling point. Her love for Ethan, her loyalty, and her moral compass battled the gravitational pull Richard exerted on her emotions. Every encounter, every word, every subtle gesture reinforced his influence. Ethan, meanwhile, felt powerless to bridge the growing distance, sensing but unable to confront the looming danger. The stage was set for irreversible choices as Richard's manipulation had peaked, leaving Clara vulnerable to the ultimate betrayal. The weeks following Richard's peak manipulation blurred into a tense, suffocating rhythm. Clara felt increasingly trapped between loyalty to Ethan and the pull she could no longer deny toward Richard. Every glance, every carefully chosen word from him seemed to speak directly to the part of her heart she couldn't control. Ethan noticed the shift more clearly now her attention, once wholly his, was fractured, her smiles hesitating, her eyes wandering toward her father with a warmth that made him ache. It began with small moments that escalated to the inevitable. One afternoon, while Ethan was occupied with work calls, Richard suggested a private discussion about the wedding plans. Clara reluctantly agreed, and the conversation, under the guise of guidance, became intensely personal. Richard praised her judgment, her intuition, and her unique understanding of people. Each compliment, gentle and precise, chipped away at her resistance. She felt herself leaning toward him emotionally. Aware of the moral wrong, but unable to stop the pull, Ethan began to sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Clara, increasingly evasive, avoided detailed discussions about their future, offering vague assurances and weak smiles. He tried reasoning, trying to remind her of their love, their shared history, and their dreams for a life together. Yet each conversation left him more frustrated and confused, while Richard's subtle insinuations undermined his confidence. "Sometimes, Ethan," Richard would say casually, "I think Clara deserves someone who truly sees her, someone who understands the nuances of her heart." The words, casual yet loaded, reverberated in Clara's mind, further deepening her internal conflict. The breaking point came during a quiet evening at home. Ethan had planned a romantic dinner to celebrate their engagement, hoping to reconnect. Clara arrived, tense, avoiding eye contact. Richard, as usual, lingered nearby, offering helpful suggestions on how to arrange the table. During the dinner, he made small, almost imperceptible gestures, touching her hand briefly while passing a dish, leaning slightly closer while whispering encouragements. Clara's guilt and confusion collided violently. Ethan's heart sank as he noticed the tension, the subtle cues he could no longer ignore. Finally, Clara could no longer deny the truth of her feelings, or the manipulation she had succumbed to. In a moment of quiet terror and clarity, she told Ethan that she couldn't go through with the marriage. Shock and disbelief overtook him. "What? What are you saying?" he asked, voice trembling. Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to explain the unthinkable. She had realized, perhaps too late, that her emotions had been warped by Richard's persistent, obsessive influence. Ethan felt as if the ground beneath him had collapsed. The person he trusted most had betrayed him in the deepest way imaginable. Richard, ever composed, seized the moment with calculated ease. He approached Clara, offering reassurance cloaked in paternal charm, guiding her toward an impossible decision. Within days, Clara and Richard's engagement became a reality, the once unimaginable scenario now undeniable. The small town, friends, and family were left reeling. Gossip spread like wildfire, disbelief etched on the faces of neighbors and relatives alike. Ethan, devastated, retreated into a quiet fury, unable to process the betrayal and feeling powerless against the man he once revered. The emotional fallout within the family was immediate and profound. Clara struggled with guilt, shame, and confusion, realizing she had become a pawn in Richard's carefully orchestrated game. Ethan grappled with heartbreak, anger, and a sense of helplessness, struggling to reconcile the father he loved with the man who had destroyed his engagement. Richard, meanwhile, remained outwardly triumphant, basking in the success of his manipulation, yet a subtle, almost imperceptible tension hinted at the moral and emotional consequences lurking beneath the surface. The home that had once been a sanctuary was now a battleground of unspoken emotions. Clara, once radiant with excitement for her future with Ethan, now moved through the house with the weight of guilt pressing upon her chest. Ethan wandered the rooms, haunted by images of Richard's calculated charm and Clara's conflicted expressions. Richard, ever meticulous, maintained the facade of control and authority, Aware that his victory was both public and personal, by the end of this section, the ultimate betrayal is complete. Clara has succumbed to Richard's manipulation, breaking the engagement and marrying him. Ethan's world has shattered, leaving him in emotional turmoil. The stage is set for the aftermath. As family relationships fracture further, social judgment intensifies, and the consequences of obsession and betrayal ripple outward. The story reaches its emotional zenith, the darkest point of human manipulation and familial treachery. The news of Clara and Richard's engagement spread quickly through the small town, like wildfire through dry grass. Friends, neighbors, and extended family struggled to comprehend what had happened. Whispers followed every step Clara took, with some offering pity, others veiled judgment. Ethan's friends and relatives rallied around him, trying to console him, but nothing could soothe the raw sting of betrayal. Every familiar street, every cafe, every gathering now carried reminders of what had been stolen from him. Inside the household, tension was suffocating. Clara moved quietly through the rooms, guilt weighing on her chest. She felt trapped by the reality of her choices, haunted by memories of Ethan's trusting eyes and the life they had planned together. Every glance from Richard, though outwardly affectionate and protective, reminded her of the manipulation she had endured and the part she had played in succumbing to it. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of confrontation, regret, and the painful knowledge that she had fractured the family she loved. Ethan's life became a battle with grief and anger. He replayed the engagement party, the subtle moments with Richard, and Clara's gradual emotional distance, trying to understand how he had been blindsided. Friends suggested confronting Richard directly, but Ethan feared the public shame and further heartbreak. Instead, he withdrew, seeking solace in work, solitude, and sporadic conversations with trusted friends who reminded him that the betrayal was not his fault. Yet the emotional wound was deep, raw, and unhealed. Richard, for his part, maintained his carefully curated public persona. Outwardly, he appeared composed, generous, and charming, attending social gatherings with Clara at his side. No one could see the precise mechanics of his manipulation, how he had engineered emotional dependency, sown doubt, and isolated his son. But inside, subtle cracks in the family dynamic began to show. Siblings and relatives who had once admired him now questioned his motives. Some distant friends who had suspected his obsession cautiously avoided him. Even triumph, Richard realized, carried its own burden. Social gatherings became minefields for Clara and Ethan alike. Friends hesitated to speak openly, while acquaintances whispered behind hands. Some blamed Clara for falling into temptation. Others blamed Richard for overstepping moral boundaries. Ethan, wounded and humiliated, often walked away from conversations, unable to face the judgment or to articulate the depth of his anguish. Clara, meanwhile, struggled with her new role, realizing that public acceptance could not erase personal guilt. Each smile she offered in public felt like a lie she told herself, while each moment alone magnified the emotional turmoil. Family gatherings became tense exercises in restraint. Siblings who had once been close to Ethan now exchanged awkward glances, unsure how to navigate loyalty and compassion. Richard presided over the household with the calculated calm of a man who had won. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle tension simmered. Clara's guilt, Ethan's resentment, and the whispers of relatives created an environment that was emotionally unstable, fragile, and unpredictable. Clara's inner conflict grew each day. She had desired, feared, and succumbed, but the reality of her choices weighed heavily. She realized she had betrayed the man who loved her genuinely, and the emotional cost of that betrayal haunted her relentlessly. Ethan's absence in her thoughts, once impossible to imagine, now became a void that no comfort could fill. By the end of this section, the fallout is fully evident. The family is fractured. The community is buzzing with judgment. and Clara, Ethan, and Richard are each facing the consequences of the ultimate betrayal. Emotional wounds are deep, social judgment is harsh, and the path forward is uncertain. The story is now poised to move toward resolution, reflecting on the consequences of manipulation, obsession, and betrayal, and the possibility of personal growth or ruin. Months had passed since the engagement ended, and Clara married Richard. The initial shock of the scandal had softened slightly, but the emotional scars remained raw. Ethan had relocated temporarily to focus on work, seeking distance from the family home and the reminders of betrayal that haunted every corner. In solitude, he began the slow, painful process of rebuilding himself, reconnecting with old friends, finding solace in routines, and slowly rediscovering the confidence that had been shattered by the manipulation he endured. Clara, now officially Richard's wife, lived under a different kind of pressure. Public appearances required composure, but privately she wrestled with guilt and regret. Every smile she offered in social settings felt hollow, every conversation tinged with a sense of moral compromise. At night, she replayed her choices endlessly, how she had succumbed to Richard's influence, how she had broken Ethan's trust, and how a small, subtle obsession had grown into a life-altering betrayal. Despite outward appearances, she felt trapped by her own complicity. Richard maintained his image of control and authority, outwardly triumphant. Friends and neighbors praised his charisma, remarking on how he seemed to have everything under control. But beneath the surface, subtle cracks had begun to form. Clara's quiet resentment, Ethan's absence, and the cautious disapproval of some family members created undercurrents that even his careful planning could not erase. The emotional cost of his obsession lingered in the air, hinting at future consequences that might emerge despite his outward success. Ethan, through reflection and distance, began to understand the depth of the manipulation he had witnessed. He recognized that Richard's obsession had been methodical, emotional, and cruel, but also realized that his own growth lay in processing the betrayal rather than dwelling in resentment. Slowly, he forged a new sense of identity, one built on independence, self-respect, and the lessons learned from the painful experience. The betrayal had left him scarred, but also stronger, more cautious, and wiser in navigating trust and relationships. For Clara, the path forward was murkier. The consequences of her choices were ongoing. She could not erase the damage done to Ethan, nor the moral compromise she had accepted. Yet she began tentative steps toward introspection, attempting to reconcile the guilt, fear, and emotional conflict that had defined her recent months. She realized that while she had been manipulated, she had also been complicit, and the weight of that knowledge would shape her future decisions. The household, once vibrant and seemingly happy, now existed in a fragile equilibrium. Richard's triumph was visible, but emotional isolation lingered, and the subtle tensions he had created would never fully dissipate. The story, ultimately, was not just about betrayal, but about the human consequences of obsession, manipulation, and the fragile nature of trust. Each character, Ethan, Clara, and Richard, carried the marks of their choices, the pain of broken bonds, and the lessons of a family torn apart by desire, deception, and moral compromise. In the final moments, the camera lingers on Ethan, walking through the quiet streets of his new life, thoughtful but resolute. Clara stands by a window in the family home, reflecting on her choices, while Richard sits at a desk, perfectly composed, yet alone in subtle ways. The story closes not with resolution of all conflicts, but with reflection and acknowledgement that the consequences of betrayal linger, shaping lives in ways that cannot be undone.